handy. I thought I would take the time to make a quick video and just show you how I make my sourdough bread. It's quite different than the usual ways. I really enjoy making it, so I thought I would show you how I do it. In this container here is my sourdough starter. So before we get started on making the bread, I thought I would tell you a little bit about my starter. Now, in order to make this sourdough starter, it's very simple. You take 1 cup of wheat flour and 1 cup of filtered or spring water. Make sure whatever water you use, make sure it does not have any chlorine in it. That's very important. Mix the flour and water together, put them into a bowl or a container, and then cover it over with like a towel that'll let air in, and you might want to secure it on with a big rubber band. You would then take that container and just set it to the side in your kitchen for 2 days. So every 2 days you would put in another cup of wheat flour and another cup of good water and mix it in. On the days where you're not adding any flour or water, you just mix it and leave it alone and put it back. By 7 days, you've been doing this for about a week, and you should have sourdough starter. Then on either day 8 or 9, it should be ready for you to make sourdough bread or any other kind of sourdough recipes that you would like to do. I keep my sourdough starter in the fridge, so this is cold from the fridge. Inside the lid here, I just have some holes punched in there that I had made. So I don't know if you can pick those up or not. Alright, and it's been about a week or so since I've made sourdough bread, and so this has just been sitting in my fridge neglected. And you can see this line of liquid here. That light brown liquid is normal, and it's called hooch. You always want to smell your sourdough starter. Mine smells somewhat beer-like and sour, and that is a good smell. So what I need to do now is get this mixed. So I want to mix the hooch in with the starter and get it all a good consistency again, and then I am ready to make sourdough bread. Now the first thing we want to do is get our sourdough starter set up and measured out. I will be using a heavy-duty KitchenAid mixer with the 6-quart bowl because I am going to be making 4 loaves at a time. I store the extra loaves in the freezer, and we'll get into that later on in this video, and I'll show you how I do that and how I handle the extra bread. And I do this recipe once or twice a week as needed. Sometimes I bake for charity causes, in which case I might be baking 3 or 4 times a week. So you can do this by hand or via mixer. In this video I will also include pictures of how to do this by hand. You do not have to have a mixer. Either way, there's very little kneading. You won't have to make any mess on the counter whatsoever. As you shall see, this is a very simple, delicious, and nutritious and fun recipe. So in your big mixing bowl, whether it be for a Bosch or a KitchenAid mixer or whether it be for you by hand, we need to start by first putting in our sourdough starter. Now I still have the hooch layer. I haven't mixed my sourdough starter yet, so I'm going to do that now. And to mix it, you just reach your mixing spoon into the bottom of the starter and then bring it up to the top. You want to make sure that it's all combined thoroughly. And as I am mixing, I am getting all sorts of bubble action showing up, and that is normal. You should have bubbles and sometimes hooch with your sourdough starter. Oh, also, and care for your sourdough starter when you're not using it. I personally keep mine in the fridge. I use it cold. I do not warm it up. I do not do a sponge or anything like that. So my starter is completely cold from the fridge as I'm going to use it. I feed it once a week regardless if I use any or not. To feed it, you just put in a few cups of flour, a few cups of good water, mix it in, and pop it back in the fridge. So, and you'll see me feeding this one in a moment. Generally, once or twice a week, I make the bread, and then I feed the starter. So now it is all mixed. It's not so bubbly, and you don't see any hooch liquid. And the consistency, you'll notice, is a runny sourdough batter. That's how I like it, and I think that's a good way to go. One of the things you might notice if you've studied or made sourdough is I don't use as much sourdough starter in my sourdough breads as a lot of other recipes require. Because of this and because of some other ingredients I'll add, my sourdough bread isn't as sour as other recipes. So I'm going to take a 1 cup measuring cup. I'm going to start filling it up. and pour it into my bowl. So we're going to do a total of about 4 cups or 1 quart of sourdough starter. When I make sourdough bread, my personal rule is 1 cup of sourdough starter per loaf of bread. Since I'm making 4 loaves of bread, then that's going to be 4 cups or 1 quart of sourdough starter. So now we're working on cup number 3. I can smell the sourdough starter. It smells so good and healthy and alive. So here's number 3. And let's get our last cup going. There's number 4. Now I'm going to save this messy cup because I'm going to be using it again in a moment. Alright, now we see inside my 6-quart bowl there is a lot of starter in there, and it's just starter in there for right now. Okay, so now I'm going to grab my whole wheat flour. You may also use spelt, or for your sourdough starter you can have it with rye flour if you would like. It's your choice. My first starter was with rye, but for years now I've done whole wheat instead. So I'm going to put in, I think, about 3 cups. So it's 1, 2, 3, and then you want about equal amounts of water. So I'm also going to do 3 cups of water, and that's what I'm using this messy cup for that we just used a few moments ago. So that's 1, 2, 3. Then I'm going to grab my trusty spoon and I'm going to mix it in. And this is how you feed sourdough starter. Now I always want to have a little bit extra starter on hand because there's been many times where I've had a friend who they tried to make their own starter, or they didn't want to spend the time making their starter, they wanted to just get started, in which case I would just give a cup of my starter to them and then they would feed it and have their own batch going. My starter is it's a few years old. It's been going strong, so it's got a really good flavor to it, and it leavens the bread really well. Now I should let you know this is a real sourdough bread we are making, therefore we will be adding no commercial yeast whatsoever. All of the leavening power will be coming from the sourdough starter, which is made just from flour and water. Okay, this is fairly mixed. I want to make sure we don't have any big lumps or clumps in there, else we'll have pockets of dry flour. Now what I'm going to do from here is I'm going to pop the lid on this, and let me show you. And remember, the lid has some cracks or punctures in it to let air in and out. You never want to store your sourdough starter in a completely sealed container, otherwise the fermentation process that occurs in here builds up pressure and it can break the container or pop off the lid and make an exploded little mess. So always have a little bit of way for air to get in and out, and that'll create a relief so that the next time you open your fridge you don't have a sourdough explosion. So here we have our big mixing bowl with nothing in it but 4 cups of homemade sourdough starter. So the next thing we want to add is some water. Now I actually just do tap water for this part, but if your tap water is heavily chlorinated then you might want to stick with filtered or spring water. And I'm just going to pour in the water, and this is 4 1/2 cups of water, and it's cold. I didn't warm it up. I know people say bread making is temperature sensitive, but this recipe for sourdough bread, you can use all cold ingredients. You don't have to warm them up. You don't have to start any sponge. Nice and simple. So now inside the bowl, it's kind of milky colored. Alright, so now we have the 4 cups of sourdough starter, and we have the 4 1/2 cups of water. I'm going to get some olive oil. This is my favorite brand. I highly recommend it. It's the good stuff. I even use this stuff on my hair and on my face. This stuff's amazing. Alright, of course I have a separate bottle for my hair and face. I don't use the one from the pantry. Okay, and I'm just going to pour in maybe the equivalent to 1.5 tablespoons to 2 tablespoons of olive oil. Actually, I'm going to leave that lid off. I'm going to use that again in a little bit. Alright, and then next, we want some sea salt. I don't use a whole lot of salt, so I'm going to palm measure about 1.5 teaspoons to 2 teaspoons worth of sea salt. Alright, and then I like some sweet stuff. It'll also add more iron to the bread. This is a 2/3 measuring cup. I filled 1/3 of it up with pure raw honey, and then I filled the rest up almost to the top with blackstrap molasses. Both honey and molasses are an excellent source of iron. Also, the honey I'm using is local honey, so that's also brings with it immune system benefits. So now I'm putting in the honey and the molasses. This also counteracts the sourness a bit. I'm not a fan of very, very sour bread, so between not using a whole lot of starter, which means possible longer rise time, and adding a bit of sweet stuff, that gives an excellent flavor. Now we're up to the time of flour. And this is a time where it might be good if you have kiddos running around to grab a helper to help. I have so far put in 5 cups of flour. My helper is helping me put in the flour. She's putting in cup number 6. And again, this is whole wheat flour, but sometimes I do use spelt as well, especially when I can get it on a good deal. So she's putting in, go ahead sweetie, you can put it in. She's putting in the last of the 6 cups, and that's what we want to start off with. So let's review. We have 4 cups of sourdough starter, 4½ cups of water, about 1.5 teaspoons of sea salt, a couple tablespoons of extra virgin olive oil, and then we have about 1/3 cup of raw honey and an almost 1/3 cup of blackstrap molasses. And now we've put in 6 cups of flour. If you're mixing by hand, get a sturdy wooden spoon and you want to mix that in. Otherwise, go ahead and get this blended in. The bowl inside the mixer I will be using, and we're going to get this blended. After it's well blended, I'm going to continue adding more flour, a cup at a time, until it's blended, and I'm going to keep blending and adding in more flour until about 10½ to 12 cups of flour have went in, and I will show you on this video what the dough should look like when you know you've had enough. Alright, my helper is going to get the mixer started for me.
Should I do it?
Go right ahead. So now I have the dough completely ready. You don't need to knead it, you just need to combine it. It ended up taking 12 cups, which is the usual. You want it so that it's like a super thick batter or a very, very loose, sticky dough. What I'm going to do now is I'm going to take my favorite olive oil again, and I'm just going to drizzle some on the top and along the sides, just a bit. Alright. Now I'm going to remove my watch and wedding ring and wash my hands, and then I'm going to work with the dough just a little bit and then get it into its pans. Meanwhile, while you have the mixer mixing the dough, if you're using an automatic mixer, your kitchen helper can assist you in getting your 4 bread pans buttered. As you see, I have the 4 bread pans out. My helper is finishing up the buttering. I'm using 2 8-inch loaf pans and 2 9-inch loaf pans. Just use whatever you got. You may also notice that they are buttered very liberally with very thick amounts of butter. That is on purpose. I've noticed with the glass loaf pans, which I do prefer to bake in, that the bread sticks to them more. But I've noticed if we butter them nice and liberally, then there's no problem in getting the loaves out of the pan once they... So I have the olive oil spread on the dough as I told you a moment ago. I am now just using my hand to spread it around. And I'm going to start working the sides of the dough so that the olive oil can drip down the sides. And then each time I'm going to start picking up the dough more and more as it's releasing the stickiness from the sides. Now the olive oil being introduced to the surface of the dough is going to give it more of the dough look and less of the sticky batter look. And you'll notice it's not as sticky now. So I prefer to use oil for this process rather than the flour. I'm just especially when you're using whole grain, especially whole wheat. You want a very sticky dough. You don't want it completely sticky free like you can get away with the white flour doughs. Okay, it's almost all the way around. Now I'm going to flip the dough upside down and pop it back in. There. Now, if you take a look, it looks like a beautiful bread dough now. It is no longer sticky or battery whatsoever. So now I have all the dough divided into the 4 pans. I've taken just a bowl of water. I'm going to dip my hand in the water just to get my hand wet, and then I'm going to smooth out the top here. Now in some of my other recipes, I make the dough into a gluten ball and then I smash it into the pan. The gluten ball technique does not work with this kind of bread because the dough is more stickier. So instead, you just kind of do this technique. Okay, last one. The next step after this is I'm going to set these 4 loaves in a nice, safe, out-of-the-way place, cover them over with a towel, and I'm going to leave them alone for several hours. It'll take several or more hours for them to rise. So, I will show you what these look like several hours from now when they are risen. As you can see, the bread is now fully risen, and it took about 7 hours. You may notice some cracking in the top of the bread and some color variations. That's simply because I covered them over with a dry towel. I could prevent that if I cover them over with a wet towel, which will keep the dough moist. The darker parts of the risen loaves are just where it's cracked or where it's dried a bit. I don't find it an issue. It still rises just fine, and it'll actually come out of the oven looking normal, so the cracking and the slight drying at the top causes no issues, so I therefore see no reason to use a wet towel. But if you would like to use one, either way will be fine. I now have the oven preheated to 350 degrees, and I'm going to put these into the oven and bake them for 40 minutes. And here are the 4 loaves fresh out of the oven. To set them out to cool, what I do is I just balance 2 loaves on top of one of the bread pans. Just like that. And this is how they look, fresh out of the oven and freshly baked. So I left the loaves out to cool for a while. Now they're down to just a warm temperature. At this point, I like to put them inside Ziplocs, and I don't seal them all the way. I leave the end open so that we can get air exchange going on. But by leaving them in there for several hours like that, they will soften. Now, if you want your sourdough bread to be nice and crusty, then don't let them finish cooling inside these bags. You'll want to leave them finishing cooling out on a drying rack or on top of their baking pans, as you saw I do earlier. I like to do this technique because I like my bread to be soft rather than crusty most of the time. And it is bedtime for me, so I'm going to leave these like that overnight, and then I will slice them and store them in the morning. It is the next day and I am now slicing the bread, and I thought I would show you how I slice it. What I do is, first of all, I use just your basic serrated bread knife, and I start at the corner away from me and I saw back and forth. I do not push. You notice also my index finger here. Alright, that provides stability. When I get partway through, my other finger will come over here and hold the slice. And I'm over to the other corner and going down. Don't push, just saw back and forth. The only time I use this finger and apply pressure is at the very, very bottom when I'm doing the last part. Alright, so watch again. Remember, start at the opposite corner. And then I'll do a few more for you to see. It takes practice, but once you've got the hang of it, slicing bread is pretty easy. So once I have my bread sliced, I return it back to the bag. Now, I don't know if you can notice, but there's a little bit of moisture in the bag from the warm bread sitting in it overnight. The bread is nice and soft, but the bread's got a bit of moisture in it, and we got some moisture in the bag. So the next step, what I do is I will leave all 4 bags of the sliced bread sitting and open for a while until the moisture dries out from inside the bag and these droplets disappear. After that, each bag will get sealed up, the air squished out, alright, like so. And then 3 of the bags will be stored in my freezer. I store them already sliced. Then the 4th bag will be put into the pantry to be eaten anytime. When I start getting low on that loaf of bread, then I take another loaf out of the freezer. Now, to defrost from the freezer is simple. Let's say this was taken from the freezer. You just take it out, set it on the counter. You would open it up a little bit so that some air can get through, and just let it sit there for a few hours and it will defrost. Now, if you need bread quick, but the only bread you have is frozen, then you can take the bread from the freezer and you can use a butter knife or your fingernails to gently pry a couple of frozen slices off, and you just pop them in the toaster and they come out tasting good. Toasted frozen bread or frozen bread that's been thawed, at least this kind, seems to taste exactly like the fresh stuff. It's really good. Another benefit of the sourdough bread versus commercial yeast breads is commercial yeast breads that are homemade tend to mold within 2 or 3 days. The sourdough bread takes about a week, give or take a day or so, before it will mold. So you have more time to eat it. You don't have to rush through it. Well, I hope you enjoyed this bread making video.